Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. Jay, this week it's a roundtable, and it is a roundtable which kind of came together in the last minute or week. We had thought we were going to do a series. Like, we like to do series, Jay, right? You know, where we come up with a concept and we repeat it every year. You know, like our In the 90s, where we take a band from the 70s and 80s and see how they did in the 90s, or our Dig in Your Scene episodes, which are always really fun. And we wanted to do one where we would talk about record labels of the 90s. Although you can't really, I mean, basically going to talk to somebody who worked there or maybe a band that was on the label. And what we have found in reaching out in the last couple of years is that not a lot of people want to talk to us that worked at record labels.
Right.
Bands, yes.
Well, maybe they're still busy running their label.
Maybe they're
Other
busy.
than that,
or
yeah, I don't.
yeah,
It's
they've moved on to
been a
other
challenge.
things. So
It's sort of it's a topic. If you're going to do it by label, it's like specific,
Yep.
but either too specific or not specific enough. Like you can't quite hit that middle ground. So
we threw it out to the group on Patreon and we said, why don't you pick some labels that you think are worthy of discussion? These are probably going to be ones that have been a little bit under the radar because of the fact that they're indie labels, or they're maybe they were subsidiaries of majors that didn't get talked about, or maybe they were only around for a short time but had some sort of impact. So we threw it out there and said, hey, why don't you all throw out some names and then we'll set up a time and chat. And so joining us, it's all folks who either have been here last week or the week before, or who will be joining us on the next episode as well. So welcome back, Johnny Hooper, who was just here literally like a week ago. And then also joining us, who will be on the next episode as well, Eric Peterson.
Hello.
Because hi. His episode is going to be coming up very soon. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's coming up. And then also joining us, they've been here before, Phil Fleming, Chris Martz. Welcome back.
Howdy.
Hey guys.
this table is truly round now. We've got enough folks where
it is.
It's not a triangle. It's not a square.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if only like two more showed up and we can actually do an actual sphere like visual, that would be great.
Yeah. What?
I'm going to spin my monitor to figure out who talks next.
There you go.
A big wheel.
If a pentagon is 5, what is it? What's
octagon?
6?
Octagon.
Hexagon.
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 Okay.
It's a hexagon table.
Hexagon table. That sounds neat.
Table.
It sounds like a badass album title.
Hexagon Table. That's
Hexagon
the new
Table.
Baroness album is called Hexagon Table.
There we go.
That'd have to be a color.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. The new
Black
Mastodon album. Hexagon Table from Pineapple Tree. Or what is that band? Is that what they're called?
Porcupine tree.
Porcupine Tree.
Or Pineapple Thief.
Pineapple Thief, Porcupine Tree. I just combined them together into the one
Their
band.
band is Pineapple Tree.
All right.
Oh,
So
man.
I'm going to look at the comments and I'm going to see who commented first. The first person to comment, was it Chris Martz or Johnny Hooper? One of the two. I'm going to just throw a magic coin in the air and say, Johnny Hooper, you mentioned Touch and Go. Why'd you pick Touch and Go as the label you wanted to talk about?
Well, I mean, obviously personal preference. I just feel like as an aesthetic, as a group of bands all on one label, I find it overwhelming. Like, it's just the quality control on that label from the years 1990 through 2002. Remarkable, frankly, and always kind of staying within a particular, like I say, an aesthetic, like a particular genre. Like Chicago rock from 90 to 95. Like it's clearly defined. And that really appeals to me because those records were so spot on for me. And I just never get enough of it, frankly.
And you mentioned Chicago. The label
In Midwest.
Yeah, it was founded by, was it Corey Rusk? Is that the name of the gentleman who runs it? And that was actually founded in the early 80s, but a lot of people are going to know him from the large number of releases in the 90s, from Jesus Lizard to, like you mentioned, all the way up into the 2000s, and still very relevant with regards to
TV on the radio.
Exactly. If you had to pick a record to represent Touch and Go, what would it be?
Boy, that's a tough one.
It's behind you.
Maybe the ones behind you?
Right here. I'm going to go with Jesus Lizards, Liar and /Goat. I feel like I can't even pick between the two of them. They're so great.
Okay.
It's just magnificent.
Chris Martz, you mentioned a couple. Let's start with Revelation Records. I don't know a lot about Revelation Records. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, Revelation, they kind of started like all the majority of their early releases were pretty much establishing New York hardcore and giving them an outlet to put out their records and get it. We're talking Youth of Today, Gorilla Biscuits, stuff like that. And eventually they started, as the 90s moved along, they started more West Coast bands and really expanding their sound. And so when I was thinking about what makes the label great and why,
I lost Chris.
Oh no! No, I know Revelation Records.
If you like
there we
this
go.
record, they'll put out a different record, and it's going to be on the label. So I'm probably going to listen to it. So like they put out. I think the one, even though they were hardcore, they started putting out they put out the first Quicksand.
Mm-hmm.
Hardcore, and then you get into another, and then later on you'll hear bands like Texas Is the Reason, and whose members were from the New York hardcore scene, but decided to put out this new sound that wasn't really called emo at the time. It was just like a post-hardcore thing.
Yeah, that was my experience with Revelation. One of my favorite bands from that label was Sensefield.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think Revelation put out all but their last one.
The first Sensefield record came out in let's see, I think they had two major label records, but that was the issue with Sensefield. Once they left Revelation, they signed with a major, they got stuck and their album got long. But when you're on an independent label, and this is so 90s that you would have an independent label that really believed in your record, and even if you sounded different from all the other bands on the label, they would still
You froze up, Chris.
You froze up a whole bunch.
Yeah. It's they're on Revelation, it probably sounds pretty good. Or they would an indie label would put out a sampler of all their bands, and you might have 16 songs from all different bands on the label. And it's all right, this might not be something that I like, just keep listening to it.
Yeah, looking through their discography, there's some very familiar stuff with regards to a band like Civ is on there, and Shades Apart, which has come up in a poll, I believe, not too long ago, and a couple other ones that I noticed when I was going through. There's also a 7-inch or a 12-inch Mike Judge and the Old Smoke. Is that Mike Judge of of
Oh, that would be nice.
Beavis
We got
and
to look
Butthead.
into that.
I gotta Into Another. They Into Another is another band from that label.
They say, yeah, I got into Revelation later. I mean, I was familiar with their hardcore stuff, but when they started doing what was now considered emo, that's where I jumped in. Sky Cries Mary, I believe, had one record on Revelation or two, but Sensefield was a big one for me.
And it looks like we've reviewed at least 2 records, Sensefield Building and Texas at the Reason. Do you know who you are on the show in the past?
Yeah, interesting.
Nice.
Eric, you mentioned one. I was not familiar with Estrus. Tell me about Estrus Records.
So Estrus is or was a Seattle-based record label that dealt with what we probably now call garage punk and surf punk. They were around from the late 80s, so they were around when the whole Sub Pop thing was going on, but their focus was more on that garage rock sound and that surf punk sound and bringing that into the 90s. And to me, once the first wave of grunge had kind of crested, they were maybe, to me, the most important or prolific or interesting label in coming out of Seattle. And they were releasing records not just by bands from Seattle, but from Canada and Pacific Northwest, but also around the country, that all fell into that sound and genre of revved up garage rock, surf rock kind of music.
I recognize quite a few of the names from the label, even if I don't necessarily know what they all sound like Man or Astro Man, the Soledad Brothers.
So Man or Astro Man is probably the best known act that was on the label for more than like a 7-inch.
Gotcha.
And they're definitely an acquired taste, but basically they were taking surf punk and revving it up with kind of sci-fi and spy-fi kind of sounds, and they were a lot of fun. They used a lot of samples, and it was always fun to play, where did that sample come from? And they would do covers like the Mystery Science Theater 3000 theme. They covered that, but they would cover like punk songs about flying saucers and that kind of thing. And for a couple of years there, they were just on fire with putting out great looking 7 inches and releases and being a lot of fun. And especially the 7-inch format, I think, is where Estrus really excelled with cool packaging, great graphic design, and then just the whole aesthetic. I thought worked really well.
I see they had the Makers. That was a band that I really liked.
Well, at least for me in the mid 90s, if a record was coming out on Estrus, I would definitely at least check it out. And then kind of towards the end of the 90s, they also started out putting out records by Nordic high energy bands like the Flaming Sideburns or the Helicopters.
Oh, they also had the Mooney Suzuki.
Yeah.
Which I think I have one of their records.
They put out, I think they put out the last Mooney Suzuki record.
They might have. And just as a tease, the next episode I'm going to be on, they put out a record by that band. And maybe even something we'll talk about from that band.
Are they still active?
I'm not sure. Their webpage currently is active, but it doesn't look like they're necessarily offering anything for sale. I believe that they lost a significant amount of their stock and personal collection in a warehouse fire a couple of years ago. I do see that the wiki entry says that there's an upcoming book and then there's a podcast about them that I have not listened to the podcast yet. But
one record label I wanted to throw out before I get to you, Phil, is Spin Art, because it got mentioned in our comments. Do anybody remember Spin Art from the 90s and early 2000s and what they were all about?
They kind of did a garage pop, mostly garage pop kind of thing. The Apples in Stereo were on Spin Art.
Weren't they one of the first to go digital? Thought that was like their hook. Is that they were selling MP3s like very early, and getting
I
Frank.
wasn't familiar with that, but
Yeah, and Frank Black was
Frank
on the
Black had a
label.
couple of records on the label.
Yeah,
on the
Apples and
label.
Stereo,
Apples
Dam
and
Builders, Jason Faulkner, Bill Janovitz put out a record on it.
Yes.
The Magnetic Fields, Tommy Keene. They had a really interesting collection of bands for what was really only about, looks like, about 15 years. But from what I understand is they like were pretty early about doing in the late 90s doing digital releases and utilizing the internet in ways that other labels were not yet taking advantage of, because they were sort of scared of stuff getting stolen and people not buying because of the digital. But that ended up folding, like so many like early adapters to digital. So, but what label did you want to talk about, Phil?
Well, one of the ones that popped up for me was Jade Tree. Jets to Brazil, the post Jawbreaker band from Blake from Jawbreaker. Loved all three of those records. I was going through the list. One of my favorites was Owls. Let's see. I remember some. Texas is the Reason was also on there for a bit.
And that was based out of Delaware, actually, Wilmington.
Yes.
And Epitaph now owns them.
Epitaph now owns it?
Yeah, they purchased the catalog in 2017.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's still active, probably just for catalog, but
yeah, I mean, they have a really interesting a collection of bands that have been a part of. I think the last Girls Against Boys record came out on Jade Tree.
Oh, the post Geffen record, yeah.
Yep.
What was the other one?
You can't fight what you can't see, or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You can't fight what you can't see.
Yep.
I mean, because that was perfect for Girls Against Boys type of sound. But Jade Tree is these days largely a catalog label, sort of like DeSoto and
right.
I mean, Touch and Go doesn't actively release new stuff. They'll just reissue catalog or license.
Just for shellac, though.
What's that?
Just for shellac, though.
Oh, sure. Yeah, because the other one I was going to bring up was DeSoto. I mean, a lot of the kind of early pre-emo type music was released on DeSoto and Jade Tree, and to a lesser extent Touch and Go and things like that.
Well, and DeSoto had like the Dismemberment Plan.
Yes.
And I think of them as being like that second home for a lot of label or bands that signed to majors and then left.
Yeah.
Like, like Jay Robbins wrapping up Jawbox, then going with DeSoto for Burning Airlines.
Yeah. Burning Airlines.
And then they did the reissues actually of the Jawbox records.
Yes.
And then the guys from Shiner, that's where the first Life and Times record came out after and I think the last Shiner record, actually, The Egg, was out on DeSoto as well. And Jay, we'll know DeSoto because of Juno, the record that we reviewed. This is the way it goes and goes and goes. I think last year that was a DeSoto release. So we've actually gotten to a couple of DeSoto albums. I don't know what the computer says in terms of our total count.
I think I'm showing 3: Juno, Shiner, and Burning Airlines as the 3.
Oh, well, Dismemberment Plan should be on there too, because we did
some.
Emergency and I many years ago.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
Might need to talk to the computer people about that.
Oh boy.
Get the intern. Where's Steve?
Somebody's getting shake hand. We have the label on that as Barsuk.
Oh, it might have been a split release, like CD/vinyl. That could have been the.
For Emergency and I. Maybe but I remember it being from DeSoto.
Would that be a sub label that they might have had?
Well, Barsuk is the West Coast, like Bellingham, Washington label that put out the early Death Cab stuff.
And their big band right now is Not a Surf.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Oh yeah, they let
perhaps
Not a
an
Surf
error
actually
in our
flourished there.
Yeah.
So. It was reissued in 2011 by Barsuk on vinyl.
Oh, so that's why it lists
go.
Barsuk. Okay. Interesting. Jade, are there any particular labels that you wanted to bring up?
The only one that really popped out to me that I really felt like I paid attention and sought out for a while was Saddle Creek. So, going from discovering Cursive and then following that back to Saddle Creek and then getting to Bright Eyes and Criteria and The Faint, which were a super cool band, and then the Tim Casher solo stuff. It's sort of like there was a moment there where they had some bands that all sounded like that Omaha scene, and it was also early internet too, so it made it easier to do. So if you knew what the label was, you could very quickly start to go find this stuff. I'm kind of curious that for you guys that were like hunting labels pre-internet or very early internet, like how were you finding these bands? Like how did you know who else was on the rosters?
So let me jump in with that one. There were a couple things. One is that, so for Estrus, Man or Astroman, my brother made friends with the local record store owner. He opened up a place that was a coffee shop and record store, and I would hang out there right after I graduated college. And he was a big Man or Astroman fan, but Estrus, like a few other labels like SST, were really, really good about putting catalogs in their releases, especially if you got 7 inches or LPs.
Oh no, they stuck catalogs in everything.
Yeah. I actually wish now that I held on to some of those Estrus catalogs because they were a gold mine. And then there would be zines, you would have Flipside or unfortunately Maximum Rock and Roll. There was also a point when Alternative Press came with a catalog for, I want to say it was Insomnia Mail Order. This would have been in the early 90s. Another one I wish I had held on to a copy of because I remember ordering things from there. And they were basically a distro for a bunch of indie labels. So you get this catalog and it would have Epitaph and Lookout and, Frontier and Triple X and all these, remnant labels from indie labels from the 80s, and then Sub Pop. And then maybe they'd carry, Reptile Amphetamine and all of those. So that was pre-internet. The way those catalogs were great. And there was, especially if you were hooked into something like the surf zine, the surf sound, there was a zine, I believe it was called Continental. They also put out compilations that had really good coverage. And then that leads into the second thing. So a label like Estrus would have 7 inches that were Tales of Estrus, where they'd have 4 bands on it. And I remember a lot of labels putting out either 7 inches with 3 or 4 bands, or they put out compilation CDs. Nitro and Epitaph were really great about selling cheapo $5 compilations to, you'd see it at Tower Records and be like, $5, I like what this band and that band, I'll check that out. But you would get to hear all the rest of the bands on the label.
Piggybacking on that 7-inch philosophy of making them into compilations, Anyway Records, which is based out of Columbus, Ohio, started in 1991 by Bela. I'm gonna mess up his last name, but it's Crumpchier. I'm sorry, Bela, I messed it up. he did that. There are a number. They used to call them the Cowtown compilations, and he would put 4 bands. So it would be like the New Bomb Turks and Thomas Jefferson Slave Apartments, and on one side, then there'd be some lesser known bands. And he did a whole series of those. And sometimes he would just do just Columbus bands, and then he did like out of town volumes where it'd be bands from Cleveland or bands from other parts of the state, which included there are Guided by Voices are on one of the splits, and the Ass Ponies from the Cincinnati, Kentucky area. And it's still an active label. It's not as active as it was in the 90s, but there are still a lot of really interesting records that he's putting out through time. The direction of the label has expanded. It's not just a indie rock punk rock label. He's now doing stuff that would be, I guess, almost like soul or neo soul, with people like Counterfeit Madison and Saint Lennox, and which is almost like hip hop. And it's all really well curated. So you know that Bela's got great taste, and you're going to get like really interesting records. So I could see people who would just be interested in buying stuff from anyway, because he's just got a great sense of, songwriters and musicians. So there's always interesting stuff coming along, 2 or 3 times a year, either labels or a couple 7-inches every year now. And that record, like I said, that's been around now 30 years. So, and it's a one-man operation, which is not bad. What just happened there? Oh, there's a chat. I forgot there's a chat.
Oh, wow, there is a chat. What?
Estrus Records Quarterly. There you go. Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah, I don't think you can post images in chat, dude.
Sorry. You also, Johnny, you also mentioned Matador. That's probably more well known. I think Matador is a part of like an indie collective with Beggar's Banquet and some others. What are some?
Matador is one of those labels that they've been just repeatedly flirted with the major system. I mean, they had a distribution deal with Atlantic, and that's how.
Well, it might be distribution, but right now it shows, if you go to Beggar's Group, it lists that it's the group is now 4AD, Rough Trade, XL, Matador, and Young Turks are all under the Beggar's Group umbrella, I guess you'd say. Okay. Which Beggars has been around since 1977 and has been an important label for a long time. And having 4AD and Matador and Rough Trade all under the same umbrella is a pretty impressive 80s definitely. And 90s group. So what are you pulling off the wall there, Johnny?
I'm pulling off What's Up Matador.
Whoa.
Which is their, I guess that was their 10-year anniversary. And then they had Everything Is Nice, the Matador Records 10th anniversary anthology here. And it's just very interesting for me to kind of go in between these two releases, because on this first compilation record, you're looking at Yola Tango, Pavement, Teenage Fan Club, Superchunk, Unsane, Balter Space, Helium, Cat Power, Silkworm, Spoon, Liz Fair, The Fall, Railroad Jerk, John Spitzer Blues Explosion, The Frogs, Chavez, Guided by Voices, Mecha Normal, Cat Power. I mean, this is ridiculous, okay? And then,
that is a ridiculous collection.
Right, that's insane. But then there's a bit of Matador has a slight identity crisis, I'd say. And when you get to the second compilation, you're looking at Arsonist, Pizzicato 5, Solex, Con. Like the sound clearly changes. It's gone quite a bit electronic, and I would say lost the original feel of what Matador was. It was like an impeccably curated, exceptionally cool, maybe a little too hipster for some people, but you cannot argue with this roster of artists. This is ridiculous.
Well, you basically, Johnny, just described Sub Pop.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's like the roster of Sub Pop in 2020 would have immediately laughed off the roster in 1996.
100%.
I mean, talk about a 180 in what the label released or anything like that. Yeah.
And as a fan, that's frustrating for me. I like to see kind of
a little bit, yeah.
You know?
I mean, it's good to branch out. Roadrunner was before they linked up to major status. They had tried to break into other things other than, you know, metal and punk. And well, I almost wish Aaron Perino was here because he was one of the first pop acts signed to Roadrunner for about 10 minutes, and it did nothing.
Right. And you can go back to our interview with him for info on that. He covers it.
And I mean, they didn't hit with anything even remotely radio ready until Nickelback, and we all know where that went.
Well, it's interesting looking at Matador. Like you mentioned, you know, Pizzicato 5 and these, they have Boards of Canada, and then they have a band like Early Man, which I would not have expected Matador to sign Early Man. Like that is early 2000s Metallica influenced alternative metal. Not what I would think. And then they also signed for a while Times New Viking, which was a band out of Columbus that was at the forefront of what's called the shitgaze music movement, which was basically just burying your mix in a pile of distortion and taking the sort of crafted distortion of shoegaze and completely downgrading it to just absolutely unlistenable noise. Which again, for like you mentioned, such a curated label, it seemed like an odd direction to go. Like they were almost like looking for the thing that was going to be the next cool thing to get them in Magnet magazine at the time, or whatever.
Well, the Matador got Sonic Youth at the tail end of their career. I think their last full studio record was released on Matador, and they have Queens of the Stone Age.
Okay.
Their last 2 albums were released on Matador, and those are pretty damn good, I gotta say.
They have 3 past artists that all start with Unrest, Unsane, and Unwound. They should tour. They should do a tour together.
The Untour.
The Untour. Eric, you had mentioned in the comments, I think this is one we need to talk about. Absolutely. Lookout Records.
Yes.
Because I think most people think of Lookout and they just go, oh, that was the label that Green Day started on.
So that is true. The importance to me of Lookout, and especially in the 90s, is this was the epicenter of pop punk. You had, yes, Green Day, you had the Mr. T Experience, you had the Donnas, I believe, were originally on Lookout. Almost every pop punk band you can think of was on Lookout. But there was also, previous to that, Operation Ivy, which Rancid grew out of, and Rancid went off to Epitaph. So they were also involved with the Gilman scene in the Bay Area. So this punk rock scene that was all ages and very.
Lookout was really good for that for that scene.
Yeah.
I mean, the majority of their roster was Bay Area pop punk.
Sure. And I'd say
stuff.
my favorite from Lookout was the Groovy Ghoulies, who I'm a big fan of. And they brought in not only the pop punk sound, but they also brought in a little bit of garage rock and a little bit of classic rock into their sound, which is to me what made them stand out from the Tilts and the Screeching Weasels, which are all bands I've enjoyed, but you know, that pop punk sound can get a little bit one dimensional at a certain point.
Yeah,
And
that's ultimately why I kind of didn't really dig Lookout all that much. I mean, the only other band other than Green Day that really stood out, and I mean, and even those Green Day records on Lookout weren't terribly distinctive from the rest of the roster. Were the Donnas, mostly because they were, you know, barely out of grammar school, and you know, but
yeah, well, I think
that's how they stood out.
the big bands that people remember besides Green Day are going to be Mr. T Experience, Pansy Division, the Queers, maybe a little
I
bit
totally
of.
forgot about Pansy Division on Lookout. Yeah.
But they were also another label that was really good about putting out 7-inch records, that was really good about putting out compilations and building a fan base and an identity for the label separate from the artists.
I need to mention, and this is not a punk band, but the first Pretty Girls Make Graves record, Good Health, that came out on Lookout, and that's probably their best record. It has the song Speakers Push Air, and which people might remember. I mean, they were only around for a short time, but that's a really good record. But that is definitely not a pop punk band. So I was surprised to see them on there.
As the label went on, they got a little more, they stepped a little further towards not quite the garage rock that Estrus was putting out, but definitely more garage noise, different experiments that are maybe 2 steps away from pop punk.
Well, I mean, when they finally folded in the early aughts, I mean, that was what was going. I mean, after Green Day broke, Lookout signed anybody that had a pop punk sound similar to Green Day, a snotty pop punk sound, and they got. I mean, Lookout for me. I know it more about its demise rather than its heyday.
So they also had this band, the Vindictives, who had a sub-label or a project with them that was called Vindictives Music Live, which were live 7 inches. So you can find a whole bunch of like 4 or 5 song 7 inches from all kinds of bands playing live, usually playing Chicago venues. So that was kind of a cool thing they did as well.
Chris, what other labels did you want to talk about?
Yeah, I brought up J-Tree in the comments, but just expound on that a little bit more. I think the biggest bands from there would be like, most people remember would be like the Promise Ring. They put out, let's see, the first, I believe first 3 Promise Ring records, and the second one, Nothing Feels Good, is just kind of like, you know, this huge emo classic. And
Very Emergency.
Yeah, Very Emergency is a great record. I think it's overlooked just because of how big Nothing Feels Good was, and just how poppy and fun that record was. And then you go to Very Emergency, and it wasn't really as catchy. So I think people just kind of overlooked it. But then, you know, also one of my favorite bands, Lifetime. They put out before they reformed in the 2000s, they put out another record. Their last record right before they broke up, Jersey's Best Dancers, is just another absolute classic record that unfortunately they broke up right after it was released, so they didn't get to tour for it. And it kind of, I remember buying that when it came out. I was disappointed that they had just broken up, but they could have been, I think that if they had kept going at the time, they would have been huge. But yeah, that just played into, so after Lifetime, which had more of like a hardcore punkish feel to it, that, you know, one of the members, he started Kid Dynamite, which was way more punk and hardcore than Lifetime ever was. And at the same time, J Tree's putting out The Promise Ring, and Just Brazil, they're also putting out Kid Dynamite. And just that was one of the things about these labels is when they put out different stuff, like J Tree they put out some Damnation records, who was kind of like an early metalcore band. If they could put out these emo records and also put out these metal records, is awesome. So there's that, and let's see, other labels. I mean, it also bears, mentioning some of the other hardcore labels like Equal Vision and Victory, that they really had some classic records as well. Like Equal Vision had Converge before they moved over to Epitaph, so they could get like a little better distro. And Victory is mainly a Chicago hardcore label, but they put out, Snapcase, Earth Crisis, the Dead Guy records, which are just amazing records as well. And these are all these labels that you knew when you saw that these bands were on them, you kind of knew what you were getting. So, even if you weren't too familiar with them, you kind of knew what they sounded like. It's like, oh, they're on Victory, they're a Victory band. Well, they're probably going to be hardcore, so I'll give it a shot.
Yeah. Century Media is like that too. You're getting metal records.
Yeah, actually,
So
my cousin is actually the drummer for a band that was on Century Media. I don't know who they're on now, but yeah, when he was like, yeah, we're on Century Media, is like, okay, I know that they're power metal, really. So
yeah, I mean, Century Media rarely veered from the metal genres. So yeah.
Century Media built their fan base by scooping up all those hair metal bands that got dropped in 92 and 93 and putting out their next records. And that was their whole business plan.
No. That wasn't Century Media. That was CMC.
I thought that was Century Media.
No, CMC.
Okay.
Because, I mean, as a
It's
child of the
Colander, right?
80s. What's that?
Was John Colander with CMC, right?
I forget who
He was the guy. He was the guy who was like the metal guy who like was an A&R guy, and he started CMC to like collect all those bands.
Oh yeah, well that's sounds like it, because I mean CMC only really lasted maybe 5 years, and their entire roster were major label hair metal bands that got dropped in 1993, and I mean
it was that's not the John Colander label. I think you're I have to look that up. So it was formed by Bill Kane and Tom Limsky, but the roster was, to your point, Phil, let's see here, Bruce Dickinson, Deep Purple, Dokken, Eddie Money,
Slaughter, Warrant,
Judas Priest, Kicks, LA Guns,
Saigon Kicks,
yeah,
Saigon
Loverboy, Lynch Mob.
Yeah. I mean their entire roster were established acts to release new music, and they always had, CMC always had the problem of questionable distribution. So like none of the acts would get any kind of promotion. Not that they would have received any had they got proper promotion. I mean, they would not have gotten radio play.
So that kind of leads into another thing about the labels in this era was you had distribution issues. You had not quite the internet, the start of the internet. The mid 90s, early to mid 90s is when you really started to see the internet come about. So you could find these records, and it also made it easier for record stores to actually be able to find them and order them for you. But you had distribution issues for smaller labels, and for sometimes some of the bigger indies. And one thing that, the question was asked, how did you find these bands? So if you went to see a band live who was on a label like Lookout, they might have, in addition to their own records to sell, they might have a dozen records from other acts on the label on their table that maybe they'd known or played with, or that the label had given them promos or let them buy some, so that, or they had played with and traded with. So that's another way that, like bands that from the same label would get their music out there. So like I would go see the Groovy Ghoulies, and the Chicks Dig It guys the Chicks Dig It would be playing. So then I would find out about them. or the Eyeliners was another band that played with them, and we're a similar sound. So that's another way just to get stuff out there. And I can tell you, as somebody who tried to run a label in the 90s, that getting distribution, especially towards the end of the 90s, was very difficult. You had to have a barcode on everything, which cost a bunch of money. And oftentimes you had to have friends at the distro. And there were also labels that would do, they would distro other labels. You know, they would be friends with other label owner, and they would trade, or they would, you know, sell their stuff through their distro.
One of the labels that I wanted to mention, because there's so many records that I've listened to, and there's a number of records that we've reviewed, is Polyvinyl.
Yes.
And they've stayed in an active, important label basically since 1995. It's run by Matt and Darcy Lunsford out of Champaign, Illinois, and you know, from the 90s, you're going to know stuff like Braid, Frame and Canvas
Yes.
came out on Polyvinyl. Bands like Paris, Texas, and Aloha, and Mates of State, and Matt Pond, PA, Joan of Arc. And then you get into, Sunday's Best. I'm sure you remember that band, Jay. We were all kind of into them in the early 2000s.
Well, you can't forget Of Montreal.
Yes, and the current roster is just as strong. I mean, they've had American Football, Beach Slang, Of Montreal, Page of the Lion. The Rentals have put out stuff on Polyvinyl, and they just continue to be a really selective but really interesting label that has, you know, stayed active, which is amazing to do that for that long and put out, you know, a pretty select group of artists that are still managing to be both artistically interesting and then also sell records.
Right.
They definitely have some well-selling or nicely selling artists on the record or on the label.
I mean, Polyvinyl is one of those exceptions that proves the rule with indie labels. Just, I mean, they never had a set sound that they were after.
Mm-hmm.
They just wanted good material, and unlike a Victory or a Revelation, they weren't after a specific sort of sound or scene. So, I mean, I think that contributes to its longevity and its consistency.
I think we'd also be remiss if we didn't mention Discord.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
speaking of consistency.
Yeah, I mean, they're, again, absolutely influential, very set in terms of you kind of know what you're getting, but they do throw some curveballs here and there. But in the 1990s, just so much stuff that was either wildly influential or, you know, going back now, you can hear where so many bands were influenced. I look at the lineup of artists and releases in the 90s, and it's crazy. I mean, we all know about the bands that jumped from minors to major labels, and quite a few of them jumped from Discord. Not Fugazi, obviously, but you know, Shudder to Think and Jawbox, and there's some others here that I'm forgetting about. But did Dag Nasty jump? Did they put out a major label? I can't remember.
Dag Nasty.
Did they go to Epitaph?
They went to Epitaph.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that's a lateral move more than a. I mean, not that, you know, Epitaph.
I don't know. Epitaph is one of those labels that started off basically as a bedroom label, but at a point became massive and huge. There's a pretty good documentary about them on YouTube where they talk about getting trailer truck pallets of Offspring CDs and like, having them outside the warehouse because they couldn't fit them in, and they're selling 5 million units. Discord's never done that.
Well, Discord's never done that. Epitaph did not expect that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they were hoping that they were going to sell maybe 100,000. I mean, that first video from the Smash record was done on the super, super cheap, and nobody expected that song to blow up the way it did. And I'm pretty sure Epitaph had no idea what they were doing. Like, suddenly they're now selling, 75,000 copies in a week as opposed to in 6 months.
Right. And still have the best-selling indie release of all time with that Offspring record.
Mm-hmm. And
Hooper, you got more for us? You got another label?
Yep, we were talking Touch and Go earlier. So
I saw you going through the archive there.
Yeah, there you go.
It's show and tell time. You know that, Tim. The sub label for Touch and Go is Quarter Stick.
Oh, yes.
Right? And with me here is this beautiful packaging of June of 44 on Quarter Stick Records. They also had Rachel's, and I think they had Seam, Mekon's, so a bunch of different artists, but June of 44 and The Shipping News are two that really got to me through the years. And I just want to show you this like incredible packaging. This is from Tropics and Meridians, and this is their second record, and it comes with stamps, for God's sakes. I mean,
wow.
Look at this. Gorgeous. Right? Gorgeous. So nice. Quarter Stick Records, really love that. And then on Touch and Go, they put out the Lounge Acts Defense and Relocation compact disc. And on that is the Jesus Lizard, Shellac, Sebadoh, June of 44, Guided by Voices, Archers of Loaf, Bad Livers, Yola Tango, Mekon, Superchunk, Seam, Tortoise, Rachel's, all on this record. Check it out.
Okay. Nice. Now, what I thought was pretty cool about Touch and Go was I remember reading an interview with somebody at Touch and Go, and they basically said that they never dropped anybody. They never officially dropped anybody. What they would say was, "Oh, your record didn't do so well. Well, you're not getting that as much money for your next one."
Yeah.
And that was their mentality on that one.
Yeah,
which I thought was pretty neat.
For the most part, in like 50-50 split of profits, and like very...
Oh, yeah, that was their deal with Butthole Surfers.
Well, yeah, Butthole Surfers ended up kind of spoiling that whole party because they brought a lawsuit against Touch and Go, and then that kind of...
Well, it was a handshake deal. It was nothing was in writing.
That's right.
So, Johnny, you mentioned the Mekons, so that leads right into talking about maybe Bloodshot Records, which came about towards the beginning to middle of the decade, which of course is the great American alt country label in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah.
And the Mekons, I believe Nico Case has put some stuff out on that label.
Robbie Folks.
Yeah, just like all of the Mekons subgroups and split off groups. Pretty much, I think it was, when I think of the no depression scene, Bloodshot is the label I think of for releasing stuff by that group of bands.
I know we've mentioned a number of Chicago labels or Illinois-based labels, but one other one that I wanted to mention was Minty Fresh, which I became familiar with them thanks to Veruca Salt. But they actually did have a really interesting list of artists that put out stuff in the 90s, such as Liz Phair and the Cardigans. When they released stuff in the US, it came out on Minty Fresh.
Yeah, the first, like the pre-hit album.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see that Minty Fresh is interesting in the way that Veruca Salt was, in a way, the sore thumb in Minty Fresh's roster, because a lot of the bands on Minty Fresh were not like grungy power pop.
Oh no, not at all. It's got like Betty Seviert.
Yeah, Betty Seviert and
Ivy.
I mean, a lot of them were almost loungy. I remember the Jim Ruiz group on Minty Fresh.
Yep.
And they're kind of a loungy act.
Yep.
Papas Fritas, that's the Boston connection to Minty Fresh. They were on Minty Fresh for I think like an EP and one full-length record. Maybe
they put out an album by the Sugar Plastic, which we reviewed like 8 years ago. I don't know if it was that album, but we reviewed that band. Other labels that you guys want to bring up before we wrap this roundtable up?
Sure. I actually have 3 that are kind of interrelated I want to bring up really quickly. And that's White Jazz, Bad Afro, and Thunder Woman. So White Jazz out of Sweden, Bad Afro out of Denmark. They were the labels over there that were putting out the Helicopters, Lucifer, Turbo Negro, all of that high energy rock and roll stuff. When those bands started to go from putting out their own records to putting out 7 inches and whatnot, these were the labels in Europe that they were on. And that scene never really broke here in the States, but that's I think those are important labels to look at. And then there's a one-off label from Germany that put out a dozen records called Thunder Woman that was putting out all female bands, mostly coming from that high energy scene.
Does Johnny have stuff from that label?
No, Johnny's looking for something else. Hold that thought.
But, this was also the era when, because of the internet, or at least email coming about, that it was maybe much easier for European labels to get some of their stuff to the United States. And, the 90s as a whole was much more looking at independent media, whether it was music or movies or books or comic books or artists. So there was a lot more, I guess, cross-cultural and, cross from Europe and Australia stuff coming in. And then you have guys like Frank Kozik and his label that's bringing in an art crowd, but he's putting out a lot of, it was Man's Ruins, name of the label. Yes. He was putting out a lot of stoner rock, but also bands from Europe. And as I said earlier, Estrus is putting out Helicopters and Lucifer, and Sub Pop is to a certain degree as well. So you're getting a lot more cross-pollination between scenes and labels in this time period. And I think that the internet and email especially was a big part of that, because you could email somebody in Sweden or Finland or Australia and, not be paying extravagant international phone call bills or worrying about the time difference or anything like that.
Well, there's another one, I believe it was out of California, I'm forgetting where, Alias. They kind of folded right at the turn of the century.
Yeah, they had Archers of Loaf.
Yes, their biggest artist was Archers of Loaf. I mean, my attachment to that label was the Loud family, and they released they first re-released all of the Game Theory material that wasn't on Enigma at the time.
They also put out American Music Club and Yola Tango and Too Much Joy and Knapsack.
So I totally forgot about American Music Club.
The John Kolodner label, Tim, was
that one was a good label.
Was Portrait.
Oh, Portrait. Okay.
They existed from 99 to 2003, and they picked up Cinderella, Great White, and Rat.
Oh,
nice.
Oh, you mean the relaunch of Portrait in 99? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then there were the artists that they signed that didn't release anything.
Probably, yeah. I just remember that being on Metal Sludge a lot.
Yes.
When that was the thing I would check occasionally.
No, you say that's something I read on a regular basis. Yes, it still exists.
Wow. One last label I wanted to mention is Slash Records. It came up in some discussions, and it also came up in the news recently because the founder, Bob Biggs, just passed away. But they started as a independent label in '78, and based on putting out a 7-inch by the Germs, and then they would put out releases by X,
Faith
Fear,
No
the
More.
Blasters, Los Lobos, Rank and File, Del Fuegos. Then they started a subsidiary label called Ruby Records, which put out albums by the Misfits, Dream Syndicate, the Gun Club, and Slash got I don't know if it was purchased, but they became part of the WIA International
Yeah,
Warner
they
Group.
they got they got attached to Warner pretty early on,
It was
actually.
'96 is when they moved to Warner. So they made it almost 20 years as an independent. But in the
Well,
'90s,
they were always
yeah,
distributed by Warner.
right.
Like since I want to say like 1980.
But you're going to know stuff from the '90s like Imperial Teen, Harvey Danger, Soul
Yes.
Coughing, Failure, Faith No More,
Yeah.
the Bodines, the Rammstein, Violent Femmes. Like it's an impressive list of artists that have put out albums on Slash.
Yeah.
And Grant Lee Buffalo. One more.
You're making me remember their logo on that Faith No More album. Just like
Yeah.
I just had that picture in my head of like that was my memory of what that label was.
Yep.
Yeah, no, but Slash almost always had major distribution. If they weren't actually part of Warner, they had been distributed by Warner for almost its entire existence.
I think they were distributed by Nonesuch for a while based on...
Which is a Warner company.
Right. I didn't realize how old that label was. That label goes back to the 60s.
Nonesuch?
Yeah, Nonesuch started in '64.
Oh, yeah.
And it is has quite the history if you look at their discography of artists and records. Well, I only knew them because the whole Wilco thing happened. And they got...
the Wilco thing. And to think Nonesuch was largely up until the Wilco thing, really, was largely a jazz and classical label.
Yeah.
And I don't know what prompted them to operate kind of as a indie version of Warner, but they got Wilco, and Wilco did really, really well with them. So
yeah, and then after they do Wilco, they start adding then, people like
Black Keys.
Yeah, Black Keys. They do the Punch Drunk Love soundtrack. They David Byrne and Magnetic Fields, and Brian Wilson's Smile album came out on Nonesuch, and so it becomes a much more diverse label. But it took 3 decades for that to happen, which is really interesting.
Well, what about Merge? I mean,
oh yeah,
we didn't discuss Merge.
Well, we can always do a part 2 for what I'm sure we're missing a few.
Oh yeah.
Johnny, what were you scrounging around for on your wall
in your
there?
library?
Yeah, it's killing me. Of course, I organized this thing today, and you think I can find a fucking thing now? Jesus Christ! Oh.
It's not organized by label. What are you doing?
Well, if I had more time, Jay, I would do that. But I was desperately trying to find my Caustic Resin records, because they're on Up Records, which also featured Built to Spill.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
And, I think Modest Mouse for a period of time as well. So,
Modest Mouse was on Up, yes.
Yeah, so I was thinking Up Records was a good one to point out, and another one was K Records. I mean, you have to talk about K. Calvin Johnson and all that he's kind of brought indie rock, and again, you talk about the aesthetic, the artwork. It's all done in house, and everybody's kind of album cover looks the same, and I just love the kind of the symmetry that K Records brought to the table. I thought that was really cool.
Caustic Resin was also on Alias.
Can somebody tell me where in God's name is the Caustic Resin records?
Is
Under
it
the
how do you got that
Seas.
organized? Is it
Yeah, look
alphabetical?
under C.
Get back to me next week.
Is it autobiographical? What's the order there?
Jeez.
I was
In the
just going-
order in which you purchased them?
I was just going for cleanliness.
Oh, so it's color coded.
Yeah,
God.
this week.
Any last additions, gentlemen? We might have to do a part 2 next year, since we missed. We're going to get yelled at for missing some. I'm just
No,
gonna say
I
that.
got just one really quick one. Does anybody remember World Domination recordings?
No, what?
They had Sky Cries Mary, who's been mentioned,
Yep.
Low Pop Suicide, Cyclone Rangers, Shriekback, Contagion, Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yeah, I was gonna say Stanford Prison Experiment is the one. I was like, I knew that label sounded familiar, and they put out Stanford Prison Experiment. That's how I remember them now.
They were one of those that lasted for a while in the 90s, but then kind of vanished.
Well, they didn't really necessarily have a big breakout artist like a lot
No.
of the labels did. So
Maybe Sky Cries Mary, maybe
but
that
they
was
jumped to Warner for one
Yeah.
record, and then they went back to Revelation, I think, or something like that.
I
Yeah.
think Low Pop Suicide was going to be their that was
Their
pushed
big artist?
at college radio. I remember that. It was one of the guys from Gang of Four.
Mm.
That's all I got.
So hard to. I mean, I was trying to go from memory on all these labels that I never necessarily followed a label at the time. But then again, I knew which ones to not follow, and I mean, unfortunately, K records did not really suit my tastes at the time, so I knew if it came out on K, I knew I probably wasn't going to like it a whole lot. That kind of thing.
Right. I think the only one, and Jay, you can back me up with this, was Saddle Creek bands played Columbus in the late 90s and 2000s so much that you couldn't help but just give everything a listen at least once when they were in town, because 1 week it'd be Azure Ray was playing here, and then there was Cursive, and then Bright Eyes, and then all those bands made their way to Columbus usually twice a year, because it was just a part of the circuit they were hitting in the Midwest.
Yep. Yeah, and all those bands were working hard. They were touring town.
Okay, I'm not done yet. Hold on. I'm from Toronto, so we have to start talking about Canadian labels. Okay.
They have those up there. Wait, what?
We have music and everything. It's really wild. You should come.
Are you gonna the network group? Is that what you're gonna talk about?
No. First,
Mint Records.
Some Sarah McLachlan.
Shut your filthy mouth, Tim. All right. First of all, Sloan was on and is on Murder Records.
Well, that's their label.
There you go. There's the Peppermint EP. What started it all.
Yeah.
They're
on Yep Rock in the States.
Yeah, well, they're on like 35 different labels in the States, but
yes, well,
but Murder Records is still very much a going concern, and they've just started. Jay and Chris from the band have started their own podcast, so it's really interesting talking about some more obscure stuff from the East Coast that they would have encountered. They also had Thrush Hermit on their label.
Oh yeah. Well, you see that they don't put out much outside of their own band these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, they had an interesting run in the 90s with signing Nova Scotia's scene.
Yeah, of course, all those guys, all the Sloan guys now live in Toronto, so much for that. From Toronto proper is Broken Social Scene, so they're on Arts and Crafts Records, right? There you go, to Arts and Crafts Records. Constantine's from Guelph, Ontario, outside of Toronto. They were on Three Gut Records, which is now folded, but they put out some outstanding records. Chad Van Galen, he's out of Calgary. and he's on Flemish Eye Records, and he's put. I think he's one of our finest artists going right now. A real eccentric, making unique records. And Death from Above. They were on Last Gang Records. So, oh Canada, stand on guard for thee.
Well, if we're going to go international, we would be remiss if we didn't mention an Australian label, and the one that came up was Murmur, which is a subsidiary of Sony, but that put out bands that we have reviewed: Ammonia, Blue Bottle Kiss, Something for Kate. Also have put out albums by Silverchair. So yeah,
well,
that's
their bread and butter was Silverchair. So
yep.
Well, we've done a Silverchair episode on here, so we can include them.
Oh, and Silverchair as well. Yeah, we did the
sophomore slump.
Yep.
Sophomore slump. That's right. And
No,
so that's the only Australian record label that I'm aware of. No, I'm kidding. There's lots of them.
There's lots of them, but you don't see them much in the States or North America, for that matter.
Right, because if they do make it here, they're going to get released on an American label.
Right.
That
and I mean, because with the Silverchair records, you actually saw Murmur on the label next to Epic, next to Sony. But,
right.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah.
I know the Cosmic Psychos put out records down there, but I have no idea what record label they were on down there. I know what they were in the United States.
Yeah.
But I'm sure,
I mean, Johnny mentioned Arts and Crafts, that they're actually a really good kind of indie pop type thing. Mom and Pop actually as well. I'm trying to remember. I believe Mom and Pop now distributes Courtney Barnett.
Yeah, and they did put out the last couple of Blues Explosion records too, I think.
No, that was Blues Explosion, not John Spencer.
Yeah, Blues Explosion.
Okay. I was going to say that when John Spencer kind of stopped being very active, they were still on Matador/Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we have crushed the 1 hour mark here.
I've learned so much. My head is just full of new knowledge.
Jay's been shockingly quiet.
I mean, what am I going to add with you guys? You're like wizards with this. Amazing.
Well, we're definitely due. I know there are a lot of labels we didn't get to, so maybe we'll come back to this. We'll do a part 2. We always threaten to do part 2s for roundtables. Maybe we actually will do a part 2 next year.
And I'm sure there's 4 of us who'll call you on it.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. You guys will have them all lined up and ready to go. We need to thank Phil Fleming, Johnny Hooper, Chris Martz, Eric Peterson, all for joining us, and as well as our commenters over at Patreon, who included Mike Bond, Richard Waterman, Darren Leach, Dave O, Gabriel Gutierrez, Jeremy Amend, Justin Wexler, David Gorgos, Scott Witt, Michelle Pennell, and Marissa Buxbaum. Thank you all for your suggestions. If we didn't get to them this time, we'll get to them next time. Part 2, 2021, coming at you. If you like what you heard, please consider leaving us some positive feedback at Apple Podcasts, and make sure you hit up digmeoutpodcast.com to submit an album for one of our polls, as well as sign up for the Box newsletter, which will arrive at your doorstep every Saturday with a calendar of new releases, as well as reviews of stuff out either that week or just before that week, depending on how much stuff I'm inundated with at a particular week. Sometimes I'm a week behind with regards to releases, but some weeks you get like 5 new records. You can't review all of them at once. You got to put some off for a week. That's how it works. And Jay, I'm still waiting for your Go-Go's documentary review. You can send that over anytime. It's been like 6 months. Watch that.
You're waiting. I publish everything. What do you
plug it in there? Just plug it in. Three sentences. All I need is 3 sentences from you. It was good. Here's what was good. Here was what was bad.
I gave my review. I gave my review on Discord. If you want to read it, you can go.
Yes, I know.
Oh, good lord. I mean, I have a 1-sentence review of that one, so.
And don't forget, we do have a Discord channel, which is filled with channels. I just added a reissue channel to celebrate the reissue of Super Drags in the Valley of Dying Stars, a special reissue coming out in 2021. I know that John Davis has been sick of getting pestered about that for the last 19 years. So
and I believe
they're finally going to reissue
most of it's already sold out.
Yes, they had to add another 250 in another color, I think, because they're doing like multiple colors and variations and stuff and such. So I got my orange color
Nice.
Ordered. Yeah, I got the credit card out real quick when I saw that one was going up. So for Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out. All right, gentlemen.
Very cool. Well done,
Thanks
everybody.
for that. Yeah. That was cool. We got a lot of labels covered, way more than I thought we were going to get to in one show.
And there's so much more.
Hopefully it was coherent.
Yeah.
I know. Well, I'm going to make a list. When I go through and edit, I'm going to make a list of all the labels we covered, and then I'm going to go through and like make a list of what we didn't that was either brought up in comments or that comes to mind, and then I can be ready for next year with actual.
One thing I noticed is that we talked mainly about labels that were successful or lasted through the 90s. We didn't talk a lot about the indie labels from the 80s that lasted, 92, 93, 94, but then
you mean like
vanished.
CZ and SST and stuff?
Well, and Enigma and the whole Restless situation. I know Restless was still around, but Triple X. I mean, there was a whole bunch of 80s labels that kind of poked their head into the 90s and didn't seem to do much after the first couple of years.
That's what next year's for.
Oh man, yeah. No, I mean, I didn't contribute to that conversation on the Patreon page, almost deliberately, because I could not think of anything other than Jade Tree and friggin' Fueled by Ramen, which started in the 90s, but I mean nothing really of note until like the mid to late 2000s when they started getting distributed by Warner.
Well, that was also the big thing with these indie labels, is that a lot of them got distro deals with majors, and that's really why you would see their stuff at Warehouse or Tower Records. Probably also the rise of Tower Records, and you guys remember the early days of Best Buy breaking out in Minnesota, that they had huge CD sections, and they would carry Frontier or Epitaph or stuff you wouldn't see in your local mom and pop's place. Or
for in my case, I'm in Boston, and ours was Circuit City.
Okay,
Circuit City arrived before Best Buy, and their whole big selling point was, our music is $3 cheaper than Tower. And so I'm like, hell yeah, I'm going there.
I remember going to HMV in Boston in December of '96 and just being like, wow.
Oh, Harvard Square one, yeah.
Of course, there were like 3 things that I wish I had bought now that I did not at the time. But
yeah, no, the HMV in Boston, for me, HMV was just way too bloody expensive. But you got the imports.
Yeah,
the imports were there. But yeah, I mean, that HMV that you're talking about, there was 7 other record stores around within 2 blocks of that particular store. A Tower, a Newbury Comics, 3 used places, all within like a 2-block walking distance. It was nuts.
I'm sure that time I went to all of them.
Are you kidding? I went to all of them on a weekly basis. But the tower near that HMV was nothing compared to the Newbury Street one that had 3 floors. Just gotta say. But yeah, no, I miss those days a lot. And most of the labels that were discussed today, I found out through CMJ. Remember that magazine?
Yeah.
Yeah, with the compilations. I actually had to stop getting them because I wound up buying a whole bunch of the albums featured on the comps, and I was going broke. Like it worked too well.
Yeah, I forgot that was a big way to discover new stuff and new labels.
Oh yeah, but I mean, another thing that we could discuss, that could be discussed next time, is those indies that were just subsidiaries of majors, and sort of like Nothing Records or Maverick or something like that. I mean, they were always affiliated with a major, but they kind of operated as indies.
Well, a lot of the indies we did talk about did have sub-labels, like Epitaph had Hellcat, or Lookout had Panic.
No, I didn't remember that about Lookout. I mean, like I said, I remember Lookout more for shady business practices and its really slow demise in the last 5 years of its existence. So
I need to take off, but
they did sign Ted Leo though.
But Jay and Tim,
Yeah.
did you guys get the last email I sent you?
Yeah, we can do the EP for bonus content.
Okay,
That's
sounds
fine.
good.
I'll add it to the invite.
All right.
So, is it streaming as well as the? I know
I
the
believe
album is.
I'm thinking that it is on Spotify at the very least. So it should be easy to find. Okay.
I can double
Cool.
check that right now.
All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks,
You
Eric.
too.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
I'm gonna roll.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks for your help. I appreciate it.
Night, everyone.
Thank you.